So now I have a relationship where I can relate the average flow velocity in the pipe, spatially average flow velocity, to the time average max for turbulent flow. And here's the relationship we came up with last lecture to relate those two things using the power law profile for turbulent flow. And we know that n is supposed to be in between sort of 5 and 10 here in this profile. And then that the average velocity for a laminar flow, we calculated earlier, that was 2/3 of the maximum profile. And remember, the laminar flow profile is a parabola, is parabolic. So this is 2/3 there. So we can rewrite this as, what the U max is compared to the average. And so if you wanted the maximum velocity and you knew the average velocity, you'd say, well, it's just 3/2. So that's something for laminar flow that we have right there. And we've been using that in various problems. But now we would like to do that same kind of thing for turbulent. If you have turbulent flow, let's take a look at what happens at different n values. So for turbulent, n equals 5, you get that U max is about 1.32 U bar. So that's just plugging that n in up here, rearranging this and solving for U max. You get 1.32. So instead of 1.5, which is of course what 3/2 is, you get 1.32. So there's less of a difference. The U max is not as large relative to the average for that turbulent flow. As n gets bigger, it gets even less pronounced. So if you go to if n equals 10, you find that the U max is equal to about 1.16. That is, it's only a 15%, 16% bigger than the average velocity. So a much flatter profile. What that means is that the maximum profile the maximum is much smaller, so the average velocity across the pipe has to be more uniform. So if you think about this in terms of what it would look like to have laminar flow or turbulent flow, if you have laminar flow, if that's your velocity profile is parabolic, and the average here is about there, so that's about let's say 2/3 of this maximum, which occurs right here. But what we're saying for the turbulent is that the maximum, if you compare, they have the same average velocity, the maximum is much less. In fact, it's barely above the average. So that means in order to keep that same average, you need to have a flatter profile. And that's what turbulent flow has. So this would be turbulent, and this is laminar. So in the laminar case, we know it's parabolic, and we know that the average velocity is only 2/3 of the maximum. But at turbulent flow, we see that as n gets big, the maximum velocity really is only a little bit larger than the average velocity, which means basically that the flow must not have it has a very uniform profile. So that's a characteristic of turbulent flow, is that you do not get the same distribution, like parabolic distribution, at all. You get a much flatter flow. It's more uniform. So at higher n, the velocity profile in turbulent pipe flow becomes more uniform. And even at the low end, when n is equal to 5, it is still more uniform in turbulent pipe flow than it is in laminar flow. So when you have, and we can also relate that to the friction factor, because since n is equal to 1 over the square root of f, that means a lower f means a more uniform velocity profile. So that's interesting. And part of the reason that's interesting to you is, of course, that we had earlier, before we were getting into the details of flow, we were using assumptions about uniform velocity for our momentum equations, for our mass conservation equations. And we weren't sure whether we could really use those approximations and how often we could use them. Turns out in turbulent pipe flow, sometimes they're not bad because the turbulent pipe flow has a pretty uniform velocity profile, unlike fully developed laminar flow, which definitely has a very much non-uniform velocity profile. But some of the turbulent flows, many of the turbulent flows, have almost what we call slug-like flow, where the flow is pretty much just almost the average flow across the whole length of the pipe. As I said, it's not quite the same. It's about, say in this case, 16% higher, and a little bit more here when you're down at n equals 5. But it's not as bad an approximation as you might think.